Hello and welcome to a Bevington Group vignette. My name is Roger Perry, CEO of the Bevington Group, and today we are going to be talking about modern restructuring. Now, the purpose of a vignette is to give you a very quick overview of key elements of a subject which is particularly relevant in today's world, and modern restructuring is particularly relevant for reasons I'll explain in a few minutes' time. But before getting stuck in, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the land from which I am broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Now, let's make a start. So, restructuring has always been around. It's been a common response to challenges. It's been a common adaptive response to do better in markets. It's been a common response to introducing new products. It's been a common response to introducing new capabilities. And it's going to be particularly relevant over the coming months and perhaps 48 months, I think, because we have a number of drivers for restructuring. We've got rising costs as inflation is still with us, and it is hard for many organizations to pass on those costs. So we've got margin pressure. And if you are not in a business, but you're, for example, a government institution, you might have rising cost pressures that you're trying to face with a non-matching adjustment in demand. So rising costs present in public and private sectors. Customer service remains a catalyst. We still have increasing expectations from customers and service. We do have pressures to change capabilities, AI capabilities being just one. And the problem with all of this is, while it's relevant, it's particularly relevant over the next 48 months, we do think that common pitfalls are still there in many restructurings. Fortunately, modern restructuring actually addresses those. So we'll go into a bit more detail. So I talked about pitfalls. Well, I think we'll have all have seen or heard of restructures that have some problems. So restructures have traditionally had a consistently high failure rate, or at least not getting quite to where they want to get to in terms of benefits. And there are three reasons we'll talk about today as to why they have difficulties. And there are maybe 20 in all, but let's talk about some of the three that appear most commonly under the top ones. A poor strategic concept, which is it hasn't been designed properly. For example, the orientation of the operating model is incorrect. So you can orient it by product, you can orient by function, you can orient by customer type, etc. And you can have multiple of those orientations inside a particular restructure. If the strategic concept doesn't match your strategic need, you can be in a little bit of trouble. And if the strategic concept includes capabilities that you can't capture or get to, that might lead to a failure as well. So there might be limited consideration of the broader operating model. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, but fundamentally an operating model is broader than just structure alone. It's certainly role, it's certainly process, it's certainly system, it's certainly ways of working, and it's metrics too. And there might be poor change management and poor ways to work to make the change stick. Now, a modern approach incorporates operating model thinking because that helps you with the first two of those. Helps you make sure your strategic concept actually aligns with your real strategy and is practical. And it helps you think about all the other pieces of an operating model. So basically, an organization doesn't work by structure alone. It's very important to be able to think about the ways of bringing the structure to life. As I mentioned, role, process, system, ways of working. Also capabilities, metrics, and change approaches. One of the key elements of an operating model, and it's also related to the strategic concept, is what do you measure? And often this is poorly designed or poorly thought about before implementation. And we start often with the value driver tree, which we'll talk about in a few minutes' time. And poor change management will definitely address, because change management has always been a difficulty, not just for restructures, but for all sorts of change, including major systems implementations. Okay, we'll start just deep diving an operating model, because there are reasons it helps you with strategic concept, and there are reasons that it actually helps you connect to the other pieces that you've got to think about to bring your restructure to life, to make it work. Because as I said, an organization doesn't just work by structure alone. So an operating model is a and holistic framework. So it's all the pieces you've got to fit together to achieve your mission consistent with strategy. I've mentioned some of the elements. And if we go to the bottom left-hand point there, organizations do not work by structure alone. It's absolutely true. You absolutely have to think about metrics. You have to do that from the conceptual phase. So when you're actually thinking about the strategic concept, what actually is the orientation? What are you going to measure? And it's important then when you actually do the structure design, how do you allocate those measures to people? Who gets rewarded for that? What are the incentives? How does that fit with the processes? How does it fit with accountability and so forth? Now, holistic organizational framework, it's holistic because it's systems thinking. So that's the top left-hand point. And that means that we know as systems thinkers that if you pull on one lever, you can inadvertently trigger another. So a classic example would be if you change a process enough, you might have to change a role, which means you might have to change a function or a team design, and vice versa. If you change a team design and a role enough, you might have to change the process. If you change a system, you might have to change the process. In fact, you really should have been thinking about the process before you deploy the system. It's a very adaptive way of thinking because modern operating model design actually builds in flexibility, an adaptive way of responding into the operating model concept. Now, we don't have time to describe how that works, but it's part of the thinking. And very importantly, because it is, if you like, a systems thinking exercise, it consciously thinks about how the elements integrate. So therefore, you're not going to get process disconnected, for example, from structure. So a classic, simple example would be often a structural change happens. It breaks links in a process because person X used to do a job. That job is now done by person Y. There used to be a communication between X and another part of the organization, but that link's broken. And no one noticed it before the implementation happened and a process breaks down. So interconnectivity is important. Now, I did talk about metrics, and just to deep dive a little bit, but only for a moment, value driver trees. So I said metrics are important from the get-go, from the point whereby you're considering the strategic concept, but right through to how you allocate metrics to individual roles, functions, teams. In essence, you're actually working out how the metrics add up to deliver an end outcome. So how that works, a value driver tree takes an end outcome. In this case, it's a profit outcome, EBIT, but it could just as easily be a health outcome, an environmental outcome, a social good outcome. Whatever it is, you break it down into its component parts, and then you can allocate those component parts across the organization, and you can set targets. There are actually ways to model these outcomes in advance, and there are lots of templates available. If you want to know more, just let us know. But considering right from the beginning, what you're measuring in your strategic concept is important, and then it's important in actually distributing metrics across the new design. Okay. Now, one of the other interesting points about restructuring and modern restructuring is there is a plethora. There are lots of tools that actually help you get the job done. So if you're thinking about operating model, you think about process. There are lots of process tools that help you get the job done. Those process tools can link to roles. Those roles can link to functions, and that actually leads into using other tools which give you org design modeling capability, including actually modeling the costs and doing before and after and making sure that you've got a list of changes that you can talk to people about. This is software that stops you having to do things on spreadsheets, that makes sure you've captured what needs to be done in the new organization and you haven't left anything behind. In other words, you've got broken links that I talked about. So it could be on the process side, could be designing your org structures, it could be on the design side, and it could be on the deployment side. And there are suites of tools that are nice and integrated, or you can use best practice tools that actually help you get from design through to deployment, that run the numbers for you, that produce the org charts, that show you where the processes will break or not break, and you've got it covered, that help you manage the risks, and very importantly, also help you manage the change. So you've got testing staff responses, you've got tools that help you do that, and there's tools right through to gathering mechanisms or basically listening posts that allow you to see whether a communication has actually worked or not. And finally, there are tools that do behavioral nudges. you need a staff member to use a new process or to take on new accountabilities or basically display new behaviors, there'll be nudges in place using behavioral economics that help people actually get to the right place in terms of the structure, and you can actually embed the new design. Now, we're not going to go through here the list of tools. We may do that in another webinar. If not, give us a call, but there are tools in each of these categories and more, and it basically helps you avoid a problem. So lots of tools that help you get there, and they can be used in an integrated way. You do need a method. Now, there are lots of methods. We have our own methods. We have 2 or 3 that we use depending on circumstance when we're executing an operating model design, particularly where a restructure is associated with one. And what we can say is, while there are multiple methods, they all have some of these components, if not all of them. You've got to scope it, of course. You've got to define objectives, link through the metrics again. You've got to understand the current state. Now, some people want to skip this, but actually, if you've got people moving from one job to another, you have to think about what they were doing, not just what they will be doing, because you've got to think, for example, about whether they've got the right skills or whether a critical process has just been broken in your new design. Have you left something behind that you might have forgotten? So it actually is important. Design principles are important not just for the design, but when you actually deploy, there will be elements or there will be things you haven't thought about or that you bump your knee against. And effectively, to decide what next, you often need to go back to the design principles. There's understanding the contemporary options. That's very important because you might be thinking of options which were in your old world, but there are many ways to design an organization, to design a process flow, to design metrics that really wouldn't have been readily available or thoroughly tested before. Now that there are more options available. You should co-design, you should model, lots of tools to help you model outcomes. You should select solutions in a rational way, and that should be a step, and there should be criteria. And then, of course, prepare comprehensive implementation plans. So they have at least those elements. But a key one, and we can't do anything on change, particularly a restructure, without talking about leadership. I used to say that leadership effectively is so critical that it is the following in terms of critical success factors. The first critical success factor is leadership. The second critical success factor is leadership. The third critical success factor is leadership. So it's communication in multiple media and multiple styles of message in multiple geographies, and getting that rolling. But it's also, even before that, leadership in making sure that this is done the right way and that the strategic concept is valid and that an operating model view has been taken. All right, so restructuring. There's going to be plenty of it because we still have inflationary pressures. We have new capabilities to build in, and we basically have changes still that need to be made in our organization and in our markets. So restructuring is going to be part of it. There are modern restructuring techniques. There are modern restructuring tools. There are modern restructuring concepts. It's worthwhile thinking about them. Of course, if you need any more information, but this should get you started. Thank you.